I have two old quotes this morning and one new quote, okay? There's not a whole lot of quotes in this first one, but this one comes, the oldest comes first in 1959. So I gauge everything by the year C.S. Lewis died. So Lewis was still alive when this was published. In 1959, a theologian by the name of George Eldon Ladd wrote his classic book, The Gospel of the Kingdom. Now that might seem pretty normal language to you today. It's largely because of Ladd. Most of you probably have never read this book, and I haven't read it in more than 10 years, so don't quiz me on all the contents exactly. And you might never ever heard his name, but if you're a little bit of a Bible nerd, you have heard what he is famous for in introducing and saying this book, the already and the not yet. If you've heard that before, that goes all the way back to 1959 and George Eldon Ladd. And this phrase has to do with eschatology, or else end times, fulfillment of prophecy, that kind of thing. And I'm not going to go into the history of that or the theology of that, really any of that this morning. But this idea has been where I've been reflecting this week on our gospel lesson, and really all of our lessons, the already, this sense of it's already been accomplished, and then this sense of, but it's not yet done. That's where I've been reflecting this morning, and so that's how I'm going to attack this sermon this morning. So we'll get to the already pretty soon, and then we'll turn to the not yet. Both our Old Testament lesson, which we heard from Isaiah 35, and our psalm this morning, they describe this dynamic. So in Isaiah 35, Isaiah laments the immediacy of being conquered and captured by Babylon. This is the context in Isaiah 35. He's saddened because they are about to be taken into exile, and so he looks back on the language of Israel being taken captive into Egypt and then taken out of Egypt, right? Moses took them out of Egypt into the wilderness on their way to the promised land. And so he uses this language to describe his present experience. And much like Eustace's mountaintop spring, or else his bath that we heard last Sunday at the end of the sermon, this is kind of the image that happens in Isaiah 35. There's a spring that breaks forth in the middle of a hot desert. A spring of life. It's a beautiful picture in Isaiah 35, and it not only will quench thirsty people, it's not only going to help the people be quenched of their thirst, but the whole earth in Isaiah chapter 35. All of the earth is sort of springing to life because of this hope, because of this redemption in Isaiah 35. The Apostle Paul, he describes this, and many of you might know this, pretty famously in Romans chapter 8, where the whole creation is groaning for that day. And then he says that we all groan inwardly as well. And so it's all of creation, but it's us very personally as well who are groaning, who are joining in this anticipation. Psalm 146, which we recited this morning, every son of man, every human one, to this point, the psalmist says, only brings about a little bit of a temporary help. It seems like that accomplished redemption is going to come with several different men, but they die. They've all died. No prince, he says, can finally satisfy this deep longing for redemption that we are hoping for. And so in the psalm, we said and we heard this morning that it's only the God of Jacob, only the Lord can quench our thirst. This is the language of the psalm. Everything inside of us, so both our groaning and our desire to be satisfied, and everything outside of us, everything that we can see and experience is groaning. It's thirsting for this day. So we are kind of satisfied, and we put our hope in a lot of temporary fixes, and this is nothing new. It goes all the way back to the beginning, all the way to our day. But the image that I was thinking of, and I know that I'm mixing metaphors here, there's a lot of thirst and quenching thirst, but I think of like, if you're blind, you don't need glasses. We don't have just like a slight astigmatism where we could fix it ourselves. No, we're blind. And we need someone to come in and do something radical to help us see, to have lasting healing. And so this is this dynamic of God has already done something. He's already shown up, and we trust him, and everything is still kind of chaotic, already and not yet. And we saw that in both of our Old Testament readings this morning. This Old Testament longing is clearly in view in Mark chapter 7. And so I want to highlight this in already and not yet terms. And so we're going to look at the gospel lesson and see the already accomplished redemption of Jesus, and then we'll turn to the question that I love to ask, and you guys have heard me ask this many times. This is, in another way, a not yet question. So what? God in Christ has already accomplished redemption. So what for now? So what? What do we do now in response to that? So look with me at Mark chapter 7, and let's focus on the already. What has been accomplished in Christ? Our story, it comes directly after what is fast becoming, and I don't know if I'm ready to declare that it's my favorite story in all the Gospels, but it comes right after my favorite story, that Jesus, he encounters a Gentile Syrophoenician woman, and they're in Tyre and Sidon. This is enemy territory, in other words. And so this woman, she falls down with Jesus inside a home in this place called Tyre, and she begs Jesus to cast out a demon from her daughter. I love this story, and I want to go into that for hours on end, but I'm going to move on. In that story, Jesus responds to her approach, though, and you might expect in that kind of a situation that he would be like very clearly gentle with her. But he doesn't respond that way. He responds in a way that we might not expect. He tests her. He tests her in that situation, and she responds, and this is one of the reasons I love it so much, this Gentile outsider who knows very little, if any, of the promises of God. She responds with a faith that is greater than all of Israel. I love this story. So that's right before. We're skipping over that story this morning, and we're looking at verse 31 in our story, and it begins with Jesus. He leaves that Gentile territory. He's leaving Tyre and Sidon. He has left that home and that table, and he's doing what we're familiar with in a lot of ways. He goes back out to the sea, out into the wild, out into the wilderness, the Sea of Galilee, and unsurprisingly, we've seen this again and again, the crowds continue to follow him there. And in verse 32, the second verse of our reading, our story zooms in on one man. A man who is, the text says, deaf and has a speech impediment. That's how the English Standard Version translates that. But it's one word. It's one word in the Greek. It's only used once in the New Testament, and it's only used once in the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Okay? So one time in the Greek New Testament, and whenever the Jewish people translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek several centuries before the coming of Jesus, it's only used once in the Greek Old Testament translation. So it's a very unique word, and it's translated deaf and has a speech impediment. I think that's a fair translation. But look, the place where it comes is Isaiah 35. This is the only other place that this word is used, and we heard this reading this morning here in verse 5 of Isaiah 35 again. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap like a deer, and here's that word, and the tongue of the deaf and the mute, shall sing for joy. Shall sing for joy. This is the longing. This is the thing that has not been accomplished yet in the Old Testament. For waters break forth in the wilderness, Isaiah goes on to say, and streams in the desert, the burning sand shall become a pool, and the thirsty ground springs of water. This is clearly what Mark is referring to in this story, in the way he crafts this story. Adam's exile from the Garden of Eden Moses' wandering in the wilderness, Israel's Babylonian captivity. There have been many moments of deliverance and restoration and then slavery again and back and forth, but they've all been partial. They're all partial, and they're all looking forward to this moment, Mark says. To this moment, this little story by the Sea of Galilee, where all of Israel's, and we can actually read all of the nations, because we just heard about this wonderful, great faith of this Gentile woman, where all the hopes of humanity from Adam to today, all the unmet expectations, all of our unfulfilled longings will be finally satisfied. And he says, right here, this is happening. So, big word. This is it's an eschatology story. It's about completion of the hopes of all of humanity, of all the world, is happening in this little interaction. It's fulfillment of end times expectation. But Mark says, and I love this, he says that this prophetic hope isn't declared loudly. It's not declared loudly in the Decapolis for all of the crowds to see. This great eschatological hope for all creation is focused upon one infamous man. Everyone knows who he is in town. So the crowds have brought this deaf and mute man to Jesus by the sea. And then continuing in the story in verse 33, and I want you to, as much as you're able, I want you to feel what end times or else eschatology, I want you to feel it in action, okay? This is not some vain speculation about when Jesus is going to come and all these sorts of things. This is the heart of eschatology, and I want you to feel it in this story. Look with me at verse 33. He can see, this man can see, but he doesn't hear. He doesn't hear the bustle of the crowd. Everyone knew him. They knew his inarticulate, unformed words, his groaning. And in the midst of the crowd, Jesus, I picture Jesus gently grabbing his hand, and he leads him away from the crowd into a private place. So this is end times being fulfilled. The crowd comes, they bring this man, this deaf, and this man with a speech impediment, because he's never heard a word in his life. They bring him to Jesus, and Jesus grabs him by the hand, and he takes him away to a quiet place, to a private place, the text says. This isn't a public spectacle. We're not broadcasting this all over the television, okay? This is not what eschatology is about. Jesus didn't hold up a staff or wave a magic wand to calm the sea just a couple of chapters earlier. He didn't do anything remarkable when he walked on water. He just kind of did it. He simply spoke in the story right before this, and the demon has left your daughter, he declares. So there's no actions, there's no tricks. And at first glance, it might seem that Jesus is doing kind of an incantation in verse 33, that he's doing some kind of hocus pocus, mumbo jumbo kind of thing. But it's not. It's clearly not magic. I think Tim Keller is exactly right. What he's doing is sign language. This is sign language. After taking him to a private place, he touched his ears and he touched his tongue. Tim Keller says he comes into the man's cognitive world and he uses terms. In other words, nonverbal speech that he can understand. Because he's not having a conversation with everyone else. He's having a conversation with a deaf and dumb man. So he comes to his level. So all the eschatological hope, all the end times speculation, when is the Messiah going to come? When is he going to restore Israel? When is he going to restore even the entire earth? The hope of the world isn't at first on display in public spectacle. It's an intimate and a gentle and a physical, personal encounter with a man who can now, and so quickly, he can now not only hear Ephphatha, he hears these words for the first time, but this man who has only ever imagined, I can imagine this guy seeing people's mouths move his entire life. He's only imagined what's happening. And he moves his mouth, and he makes a bunch of groanings and moanings and loud noises, and everyone knows this guy. Maybe you know someone who's deaf. He's never heard a word, and he hears it, and not only that, he can now speak. Immediately, he speaks. It was intelligible. Just before this world-changing moment, just before he says, "Be opened." In verse 34, Mark tells us that Jesus, he sighed. He audibly moaned. That's what this word means. He moaned as if he was in pain. It's not a common word. It's only used a few times in the New Testament. This is the same word used of the groaning of creation in Romans chapter 8. And our groaning inwardly, and our longing, our deep longing for that day of redemption. We're not just inside of us, but everything outside of us is crying out for that day. And Paul uses this again in 2 Corinthians when he says that we are groaning, we can't wait for a resurrection body. So this is clearly the consummation of all things is taking place right here. That's what Mark is saying. So here in Mark chapter 7, as Jesus begins the eschatological restoration of Isaiah 35 in this private conversation in the wilderness by the Sea of Galilee, in this intimate encounter, he groans. Why? Why does he groan? Why does he groan right before he's about to heal this guy? Just before Isaiah's desert oasis, where the deaf and the mute sing songs of joy, Isaiah says this in verse 4, right before what we heard this morning in Isaiah 35, verse 4. Say to those who have an anxious heart, be strong, fear not. Behold, your God will come with vengeance. Your God will come with vengeance, with the recompense of God. He will come and save you. So, hear this again. For those of us who have an anxious heart this morning, which is kind of like the way to describe all of us most days, especially as you get older, anxieties increase and all these sorts of things multiply in our life. Listen to this. Behold, look, God, and we might read, God the Son stands before a man who is no longer deaf and mute, and in this presence a spring oasis has burst forth from the burning sand. So you don't need to be afraid. Be strong. Don't be afraid. He's with you. How does he do this? Isaiah says, God will come with divine retribution and save you. That phrase, that idea, God is going to come with divine retribution and save you, doesn't sound like the story that we just heard, does it? Those don't sound like they go together, but they definitely do. They definitely do. This is what divine retribution looks like at first. It definitely looks like this at first. A private, intimate encounter with a man who is no longer deaf and dumb. And what does Jesus groan? So why does Jesus groan as he heals this man? Because Jesus knows the cost. He knows that divine retribution will be satisfied soon. He absolutely knows. He is going up every day to that place where he will not only unstop the ears of the deaf and help them to speak, but he will forgive sins. He will heal every wound. He knows the cost of this healing, which points forward to the restoration of every body, and all creation. And he moans, and he moans, and he says, Ephphatha. Jesus moans in answer to every moan that we have. If you're groaning inwardly, if you're groaning outwardly, some of us are good at either one of those, and we kind of go back and forth. He hears it, and he says, I have come to answer that longing, to bear that longing. Despising the shame, Isaiah will say later, Jesus became a public spectacle to heal your shame in private. He became a public spectacle so that we don't have to be a public spectacle anymore. Be strong. Fear not. This is already ours in Christ. Behold, your God will come with vengeance. With the recompense of God, he will come and save you. Your feet, you can use all the images that you want. It's all coming together here. Your feet can be hot and burning sand, and it's as if a cold spring water bursts up forth, and you're not hurting anymore. You're not in pain. So we're invited to jump into the pool. I'm going to keep running with that Eustace analogy as long as I can make it work. So that's the already. That's the gospel that we're invited to put our faith in Jesus this morning again. That is the gospel, which is already accomplished for us. We can enter into that by faith this morning. So here's my favorite question. So what? You might be saying this morning, that's a really great story about Jesus healing a nameless man 2,000 years ago, but where is he now? It's a good question. I don't know if you've asked that question. What about my anxiety? What about my anxious heart today? What about the people I love who are suffering right now, who are hoping for healing, but it seems so far away from them? Where's Jesus now? Adam and Eve never met the everlasting offspring. They never met that expectation. Moses never saw the promised land. David died before the temple was built, and according to Samuel, he was pretty depressed when he died, and his house was in chaos, and it immediately split as soon as he died. You might be saying, I feel way more like Isaiah and all those other Old Testament people right now, but I'm supposed to be like a New Testament Christian, right? I'm supposed to be someone who lives in this already accomplished redemption in light of this gospel, and yet I feel this longing still, this deep longing, this not yet. How long, O Lord? I hear all those psalms, and they feel like my psalm. In other words, we repeat this story every Sunday. Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. How long? How long, God? How long till that happens? Why, in other words, why did, when you resurrected from the dead, Jesus, why didn't you stay? And why did you ascend to the Father and leave us in the wilderness alone? That is the question of not yet for us. The already and the not yet. So I've been reflecting on that a lot this week. And guess what? I'm not going to answer it for you this morning. In so many ways, this is essentially what I would say most, if not all, of the New Testament letters are trying to help us process in this moment. James, for sure, and we're going to turn our attention to James chapter 1 here in a little bit at the end. And I think this may or may not, I'm not sure, it might turn into a whole series on James over the next month or two. But I think of this hip-hop song. This is the quote, Logan, that's on the screen here. I'm going to put the lyrics on the screen because I'm not going to rap them, but it's also lyrics of a song. If you don't hear anything I say right after this for the next 5 minutes, this is a good way to think about this. This is propaganda at the very end of one of my favorite beautiful eulogy songs. He says it like this: I like it when the wind shifts They say it's the movement of the Spirit, still small voice. Y'all hear it? Remember that time I saw that leaf fall? I was positive it was God's call. Wait for it. Listen close. Y'all missed it. I cite Gideon, Samson, Paul, maybe Adam and Moses and David and all the Isaiah and all the other people we've cited here this morning. I cite Gideon, Samson, Paul. Elijah saw the clouds split, and I know that God did it and does it still. Still, his presence feels like chills, right? And if I'm honest, it doesn't happen often. Something must be wrong, propaganda says. It's boring when my life is more like the book of Ruth than Exodus. And if you don't get that reference, the book of Ruth doesn't mention the name of God at all. That's what he's saying, even in the Old Testament. I don't see God anywhere. It's boring. My life is more like the book of Ruth than Exodus. I've never seen the parting of an ocean, or a cloud by day, or a pillar by night, or maybe a deaf man restored miraculously. Just the normal, everyday working of life, where things that suck royally is evidence of his royalty. Scratch your temple so deep it's simple. Silly us, ignore the plain. We prefer a riddle, dying to see a miracle while holding God's diary, looking for signs. Looking for signs. This is what our life feels like a lot. It feels like the normal, everyday working of life. This present, not yet experience. So why not yet? Why does Jesus still make us wait in longing for redemption? New Testament Christians, we know that Christ is the fulfillment of all of the longings of Israel and of us. We've seen and we've trusted by faith that He has already accomplished this redemption. And so let's turn our attention to James chapter 1 to get part of an answer. James chapter 1, he begins this letter, and he gets straight to his answer. Introduction is one verse, and in verse 2, James says that joy, and in many ways I think this is the theme of his letter, true joy, or else lasting joy, joy that will be everlasting, can only be formed while facing trials with patience. So let me say something pretty obvious. I'm going to pick on the kids for a minute. Children don't have patience. Can I get an amen? Yeah. We have to teach them to have patience. That's not easy because we're very impatient with our children, right? That's very difficult. I want candy, give it to me. I like the way that tastes. I want it now. This is a kid's mindset. I don't want to wait my turn. This is what children do. We all come out of the womb this way. But how many of you guys know from your workplace, from your own soul, from your own private life, from church experience, how many of you know that adults don't want to wait either? Most of us are very childish. I want my paycheck right now. Give me an advance on my paycheck. Even before I actually do the work, I want you to give me the money. I don't want to wait my turn. I want to satisfy my desire as soon as I feel that desire. As soon as I feel it, I'm hungry. I want to eat right now. I don't want to wait. I don't want to practice any sort of patience. I know that Christ is coming to redeem and restore all things and to bless us. I want to have all that now. I want it right now. I'm feeling sexual desire. I need to act upon it right now. I feel physical pain. I take a pill right now. I feel emotional pain, so I try to fix that too. I run away, or I drink, or I distract myself by swiping to another video, so I don't have to feel the pain that I have inside, the groaning inside. This is what I was reading a historian by the name of Christopher Lasch this week. This is our culture's incessant Longing to be freed from longing. So that's a powerful phrase. Our longing to be freed from longing. I want what I want right now. He wrote that in 1979. In 1979, he wrote this way before two-day shipping and way, way before smartphones. Longing to be freed from longing is Lash's definition of narcissism. So, the definition, according to Lash, and this is actually in psychological literature for the last 45 years since he wrote this book, is one of the most agreed upon definitions, certainly among counselors and psychologists. Narcissism is the longing to be freed from longing. So if that's too much for you to grasp this morning, and you've never heard the myth of Narcissus, it's an old Greek myth, or else the curse of Narcissus, some people talk about it. It's this story of this beautiful Greek god, this beautiful man who is staring at his own reflection in the pool. And usually this myth is talked about in such a way that he is so beautiful. In other words, he talks about, narcissism is often talked about is, I'm infatuated with my own beauty. It's self-love. It's that sort of thing. But that's really, I don't think that's really what's going on. It's not so much self-love, it's self-fixation. All I can do is focus on myself. Everything revolves around me and my desires. I don't want to long for anything. And so I am longing to be freed from longing all the time. And so I immediately satisfy my desires. I immediately gratify everything I need. And what's more, this word narcissus in the Greek, it comes from the word narc, which means numb. It means numb. It's perfect for our life. This is what we do. We numb ourselves. This is narcissism. It's this longing to be freed from longing. So why has Christ not fully and finally restored all things? If it was true 45 years ago that we are so incessantly wanting to get rid of any sort of anticipation, if we want now, I don't want to have any longing, I want to be satisfied immediately now. If that was true 45 years ago, then our self-focused culture of narcissism, as Lash called it, with ever-diminishing expectations and satisfaction, is so much more true today. And I think in many ways, the letter of James to the church helps us. What do? We know that Christ has accomplished our redemption fully and finally. What do we do now? So what now? James says that we don't want pain. We don't want to do hard things. We don't want trials. We don't want anxiety. And we certainly don't want to wait. Fix it now. James describes this as waves of the sea billowing, or else gusting wind that is tossing us over and over again. We're unstable in all of our ways. And James says, the way of blessedness now is to remain steadfast and to wait upon the Lord. He's forming us. And much like the myth of Narcissus, who's staring at his reflection in the pool, in the midst of pain and shame and trials and sin, James invites us in our reading this morning to stop ignoring ourselves when we look in the mirror, to stop numbing our pain, but to stare it face on, because Christ has taken upon our groaning. He invites us to be quick to listen. Be quick to listen, hear the gospel, be quick to listen, and slow in everything else. Slow to speak, slow to anger, slow to react, all these sorts of things. Slow down and listen. Listen and receive, in other words, this small story of gospel healing with meekness. Receive it this morning by faith and trust that God knows what He's doing by telling you, like a parent to a toddler, no, 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 child. I want you to learn to be patient. He invites us to listen, and if we believe and we trust by faith this morning, it will save our souls, James says. So I want to invite you this morning. Don't numb yourself. Don't distract yourself from your pain. Attend to the gospel. Read these stories. Read these letters. Pay attention to what they're calling us to do, even in the midst of all of your sickness and all of your pain, all of your longings, all of the unmet expectations and dissatisfaction that you feel. Yes, even with God, listen. Be quick to listen and slow to speak. Actively wait upon the Lord, even as we care for others in their affliction. But this is the invitation of our text. This is the invitation of our waiting. And I'm committing to it right now. We're going to stay in James for the next 2 months. I really look forward to reflecting on this more. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.